They didn't lose you in one moment. They lost you slowly, through the choices they kept justifying, the emotions they kept delaying, and the truth they weren't ready to face. But what they avoided didn't disappear. It stayed. It grew. And now, in the silence they can no longer escape, everything they once ran from is finally coming back to meet them as clarity, regret, and undeniable understanding. They made a choice that felt safer in the moment, rather than truer to who they actually are. They leaned toward what was familiar instead of what required depth. They followed what was easier to step away from instead of what might have challenged them to grow in a real, irreversible way. And once that realization begins to form inside a person, it doesn't simply dissolve with time. It settles, quietly, persistently. It shows up in places where distraction no longer works the same way. It appears in the pauses between conversations, in the empty moments that can't be filled with noise or activity, in the repetition of ordinary days that slowly start to feel heavier than before. In that stillness, something becomes harder to ignore. How little life was actually asking of them in terms of emotional growth, and how much of their authentic self they had been suppressing just to keep everything comfortable, predictable, and under control. And that is usually the point where denial starts to lose its strength. What they once had with someone else may have looked stable from the outside, structured, even acceptable by ordinary standards. But what they experienced with you carried something different entirely. There was depth in it, there was emotional weight, there was meaning that didn't need to be performed or proven, and connections like that don't simply disappear just because someone turns away from them. They don't vanish on command. They remain in the background of the mind, unspoken but present, waiting for the moment they are finally acknowledged instead of avoided. Eventually, a shift begins to happen within them, not in a dramatic or sudden awakening, not as a single moment where everything becomes clear at once, but in a slow accumulation of honesty they can no longer outrun. Piece by piece, they start admitting to themselves what they didn't want to face before, that they were never fully present where they were, that something essential always felt missing even when they tried to convince themselves otherwise. And no matter how much they attempted to move forward mentally or physically, a part of them never actually completed what was left unfinished with you. They begin to understand that the connection was never truly given a fair chance. Not because it lacked substance, but because it required something they weren't fully prepared to offer at the time. It required emotional courage. The kind that asks a person to stay open without defenses, to risk rejection without retreating, to risk being seen completely without controlling the outcome, to risk change, even when change feels uncertain. And now that awareness carries a truth they can no longer hide from. It is not dramatic. It is not polished. It doesn't arrive as an apology wrapped in perfect words or emotional performance. It is quieter than that, but far more powerful. It simply becomes clear to them that they understand now. They understand what you represented in their life. They understand that what they were actually running from was never just you, but the parts of themselves they were not ready to confront. And that realization doesn't stay on the surface. It changes something deeper within them, because once someone clearly sees their own pattern of avoidance, they cannot fully unsee it again. They can try to distract themselves, they can try to rationalize it, but the awareness remains underneath everything. There is no complete return to ignorance after that point. Whether they ever choose to speak again or remain silent indefinitely, something within them has already been permanently altered. The version of reality they once held onto no longer fully holds together the same way. The illusion they built around emotional safety begins to break apart, and that collapse is not comfortable for them. It is both humbling and painful at the same time. And what becomes important for you to hold onto in all of this is a much clearer truth. None of it was ever a reflection of your worth. None of it was ever a measurement of your value as a person or as a connection. It was always about their capacity at that time, their readiness, their emotional limits, their internal fear of what real depth requires from someone who is not yet prepared to meet it fully. You were not replaced by something better. You were encountered by someone who simply did not yet have the ability to meet you where you genuinely were, and now they are left standing in the aftermath of that gap between potential and readiness, carrying the weight of what they delayed, what they avoided, what they chose not to fully engage with when it was present in front of them. That is the real impact settling in for them now. Not a dramatic reunion, not a sudden reversal of everything, but the quiet confrontation with truth as it finally lands without distortion. Because real connections leave traces, they imprint themselves, and what is real does not get erased by distance, distraction, or avoidance. It only gets postponed in awareness. And now, in that awareness, they are beginning to understand that their choices were shaped far more by fear than by a lack of recognition. They saw the value, even if they didn't act in alignment with it. The hesitation, the inconsistency, the emotional pulling away, all of it was rooted in what they were not yet brave enough to face within themselves. Now that fear is no longer hidden in the background, it is visible to them. And with that visibility comes responsibility. Even if unspoken, they are left with a clarity that feels heavy because it cannot be softened anymore through excuses or selective memory. They can finally see what was ignored, what was postponed, what can no longer be undone, and how deeply their silence or inconsistency affected something that was genuine and deserving of full presence, honesty, and emotional effort. But this is not a plea. It is not a request for return. It is not a door being reopened. It is simply the truth settling into place, as it is, without distortion. And in that truth, one thing remains unchanged. What was real between you was never ordinary, and what is real always leaves an imprint that no amount of avoidance can ever fully erase. It is, at its core, a quiet admission rather than a declaration. A restrained form of honesty that only becomes possible after distance, reflection, and emotional maturity have done their work. There is no performance in it, no attempt to impress or persuade, no desire to reshape the past into something more comfortable than it was. Just a simple, unavoidable recognition of what was real and what could no longer be denied once the noise faded. In that recognition, they begin to see the courage you carried throughout it all. Not the loud kind of courage that seeks attention, but the quiet kind that remains steady even when it would have been easier to detach, to reduce effort, or to accept less than what your heart knew it needed. The willingness to stay emotionally honest, the refusal to accept half presence, half effort, or half truth. The insistence on being met fully, not partially, even when that insistence came at a personal cost. And in seeing that clearly now, something else naturally emerges alongside it. Respect for your authenticity, and regret for their own inability to match it when it mattered most. Not regret in the sense of dramatic self-punishment, but a sober recognition that something real was not met with equal presence. Something meaningful was not held with the care it required in real time. That regret does not arrive loudly. It is not theatrical, not expressive in a way that seeks relief. It is quieter than that, more internal, more persistent. It shows up in moments they did not plan for, in late hours when distraction no longer works, in pauses between thoughts that last a little too long, in memories that surface without permission and refuse to be fully pushed away. It is not something they can easily resolve because it is tied to what was left incomplete rather than what was openly concluded. And what those moments keep bringing back is not simply the memory of a person, but the weight of missed honesty, avoided clarity, and unspoken emotional responsibility. They begin to understand that what slipped away was not just comfort or familiarity, but something far more meaningful, real emotional connection that cannot be substituted, replicated, or replaced through avoidance, distraction, or the passing of time alone. Within every decision they made, there was still an awareness of you. Even when they were not expressing it directly, even when they were distancing themselves or trying to move in another direction, that awareness remained in the background of their emotional landscape. It did not vanish. It accumulated. It deepened. It became something more defined over time, until eventually it formed a presence that could no longer be ignored or rationalized away as insignificant. At this point, there is no request hidden inside it. No expectation disguised as reflection. No demand for forgiveness, reconciliation, or return. Only the arrival of understanding, delayed, but now unavoidable. Understanding that does not seek to change the past, but simply to finally see it clearly without distortion. They are no longer speaking from the place they once were, no longer avoiding what they felt, no longer splitting attention between truth and distraction, between emotional awareness and emotional escape. The hesitation, the distancing, the tendency to withdraw from vulnerability, all of it has been looked at directly rather than bypassed or minimized. And in doing so, one realization stands out with unmistakable clarity. The person they struggled to fully show up for was always you. That awareness carries weight because it reshapes how they now interpret connection itself. It alters how they understand honesty, presence, emotional responsibility, and what it means to truly meet another person where they are. Even if nothing is acted upon, even if the past remains unchanged, the internal clarity does not fade. It stays with them as a reference point they cannot unlearn, a quiet reminder that changes how they perceive future connections as well. This is no longer about impulse or emotional escape. It is about comprehension, about seeing consequences without distortion, about recognizing that what they once treated as optional, negotiable, or uncertain held far more meaning than they allowed themselves to acknowledge in real time. And that realization is not easily undone because it is rooted in experience rather than assumption. And that recognition permanently changes their internal landscape. Because once someone fully sees what they avoided, they cannot return to the version of themselves that was unaware. The understanding remains, even in silence, even in distance, even in the absence of any external resolution. What you are being asked to hold on to now is not confusion, but clarity, not emotional pull that pulls you backward, but grounded awareness of your own worth, your own direction, and your own emotional boundaries. There is a point where reflection stops being something you carry as weight and instead becomes something you use as perspective. You already know, at a deeper level, what aligns with your peace and what disturbs it. You already understand what genuine effort feels like and what partial presence feels like when compared to it. That awareness is not new. It has been forming through experience, observation, disappointment, and emotional learning over time. It has been shaped slowly, through what you accepted and what you eventually could not ignore anymore. So whatever comes next should not be driven by uncertainty or unfinished emotional loops, but by steadiness, by self-respect that does not bend itself around someone else's delayed understanding, no matter how sincere that understanding may eventually become. Because sometimes the truth of a situation is not just what someone finally realizes, but what you were already aware of long before they did. And even though human attachment can be complicated, shaped by fear, avoidance, emotional immaturity, and internal conflict, that does not erase clarity when it arrives. Fear can influence distance. Fear can influence hesitation. Fear can influence inconsistency in ways that feel confusing from the outside but are internally defensive on the inside. Fear of vulnerability, fear of emotional exposure, fear of losing control. These forces often sit beneath choices that appear simple on the surface but are far more conflicted internally than they seem. Still, understanding the reason does not change the outcome. It only explains it. And in that space between explanation and acceptance, your clarity becomes the most important thing you have, not as a reaction, but as a foundation. In moments like these, a person can drift into other connections, not always because of genuine love, but often because of comfort, distraction, or the quiet need to avoid emotional depth. Yet, even while that happens, the connection they once shared with someone who required honesty, presence, and real emotional courage does not simply disappear. It lingers. It stays active in the background of their thoughts, resurfacing in memories, comparisons, and unspoken reflections that shape their inner world in subtle but persistent ways. What begins to form over time is a sense of regret. Not the loud, dramatic kind, but something quieter and far more personal. It comes when avoidance no longer fully works, when distractions lose their strength, and when silence becomes unavoidable. In those moments, late at night, in stillness, or during emotional pause, they begin to see the cost of the choices they made. It is no longer just about missing a person. It becomes about recognizing the fear that influenced their decisions, the honesty they delayed, and the depth of connection they never fully honored when they had the chance. And this kind of realization carries weight because it naturally brings accountability with it. It softens pride. It creates humility. And if it is faced honestly, it becomes a doorway into real inner growth. At the same time, this process is never happening on only one side. While one person is slowly confronting their emotional avoidance and learning to take responsibility for it, the other is also evolving in a different direction. They are no longer standing still in the past. They are learning boundaries. They are protecting their peace more intentionally. They are becoming more aware of what they will and will not accept emotionally. In that way, both individuals are changing, just not always at the same pace or in the same way. And if clarity eventually arrives for one, it often meets a version of the other who has already grown stronger, more grounded, and more self-aware. This is what shifts any potential future interaction away from confusion or emotional dependency and into something that can only exist through conscious choice and maturity. There is also a deeper truth underneath all of this. Emotional presence is not always aligned with physical reality. A person can appear fully engaged in another relationship, interacting, communicating, even functioning normally on the surface, while still carrying unresolved emotional attachment in the background of their inner world. This creates an internal split, where outward behavior and inner emotional reality do not fully match. At first, this duality may feel manageable, but over time, it becomes draining. Emotional division is not something a person can maintain indefinitely without consequence. Eventually, awareness begins to break through the avoidance. Thoughts become harder to silence. Emotions resurface more clearly, and what was once pushed aside begins to demand attention. This is where reflection begins to take shape, not always intentionally, but often through quiet triggers, fatigue, silence, repetition, or moments where life no longer provides enough distraction to stay disconnected from inner truth. Through that process, a deeper understanding starts to form. Real emotional connection is not built on ease or convenience. It requires honesty, vulnerability, and responsibility. And these are precisely the parts many people struggle to stay present with when fear enters the picture. Fear of intimacy, fear of losing control, fear of being fully seen. These fears often guide decisions more than people realize, even when they appear to be acting logically on the surface. But what is real does not disappear simply because it is avoided. It continues to leave an imprint. It continues to influence perception. And over time, it becomes increasingly difficult to separate present experiences from unresolved emotional history. At the same time, the person who once asked for honesty and real presence is not remaining frozen in that moment. They are growing too, becoming more self-aware, more emotionally grounded, and more selective about where they invest their energy. That growth changes everything, because it ensures that if paths ever cross again, it will not be from a place of need or confusion, but from clarity, strength, and emotional maturity. Another important realization emerges here. Emotional attachment does not always depend on proximity. Even when someone moves forward externally, parts of them can remain internally tied to what was never fully resolved. This presence is subtle, but it shows itself through memory, thought patterns, and emotional reflection that occur without conscious effort. Eventually, carrying unresolved emotional tension becomes too heavy to ignore. The mind begins to seek resolution, not necessarily through action, but through understanding. And in that understanding, the truth becomes harder to avoid. What was real could not simply be erased, only postponed in awareness. This also reveals something essential about timing. When someone is not able to meet a connection fully, it does not reduce the value of the other person. It only reflects their own emotional readiness at that time. And when clarity finally arrives, it does not rewrite the past. It only changes how it is seen. What remains most important through all of this is self-respect. Your value was never determined by someone else's ability to recognize it in the moment. Your clarity, your emotional honesty, and your capacity for depth were always real, even if they were not fully received or matched. And in the end, one truth stays consistent. Emotional clarity does not lose its meaning over time. It shapes how you move, how you choose, and how you protect your inner peace going forward. If this reflection finds you at the right moment, let it serve as a reminder to stay grounded in your awareness. Trust the growth you've already earned and move ahead from a place of stability rather than uncertainty. In conclusion, what this entire reflection ultimately reveals is not just the story of a connection between two people, but the deeper truth of emotional timing, awareness, and personal growth. At different points in life, people do not always meet each other with the same level of readiness. One person may be fully open, emotionally honest, and willing to build something real, while the other may still be influenced by fear, avoidance, or the need for emotional safety. This imbalance often leads to distance, confusion, or inconsistency, not because the connection lacked meaning, but because emotional capacity was not aligned in that moment. Over time, however, distance creates perspective. What was once avoided does not simply disappear. It returns through reflection, silence, and memory. And in that reflection, clarity begins to form. A person starts to see not only what they lost, but also what they were not ready to receive. They begin to understand that their choices were shaped more by fear and emotional limitation than by truth or lack of feeling. This realization does not change the past, but it changes the person carrying it. It brings awareness, accountability, and often a quiet form of regret that cannot be undone or easily expressed. At the same time, the other side of this experience is also evolving. The person who once gave emotional honesty, depth, and presence is not remaining stuck in waiting or confusion. They are growing stronger. They are learning boundaries, self-respect, and emotional independence. They are becoming more grounded in their worth, no longer measuring themselves through someone else's inability to meet them fully. This growth is essential because it transforms pain into clarity and attachment into understanding. What becomes clear through this entire process is that real emotional connections do not disappear. They evolve in meaning. Even when they are not sustained in the way they could have been, they leave an imprint. But that imprint is not meant to trap a person in the past. It is meant to teach them something about truth, timing, and emotional responsibility. Eventually, both paths lead to the same realization in different ways. One person learns through absence and reflection. The other learns through growth and self-discovery. And in that space between realization and acceptance, both individuals are changed permanently. But the most important takeaway from all of this is simple and powerful. Your worth was never defined by someone's inability to stay, choose, or show up fully. Your value was always complete on its own. The right connection does not require you to question that value. It recognizes it naturally. So as this chapter is understood in its entirety, the final truth remains grounded in clarity rather than emotion. What was real mattered, what was meant to grow will always teach, and what was not aligned was never a reflection of your inadequacy, but only a reflection of timing, readiness, and emotional capacity. And moving forward, the only direction that truly matters is the one where you carry your self-respect forward without compromise, your awareness without doubt, and your peace without negotiation.